It's not an understatement to say that Stellaris has had an absolutely wild year. Although the developers have never been shy about ripping out core game mechanics and changing how we enjoy our Xeno-purging simulator, I feel like the devs are getting back into a stride with paid content that many other Paradox titles cannot match at the moment. Generally speaking, Stellaris has had an absolutely stellar, pun intended, free and paid content release history up until Nemesis, and we may be seeing a return to form. Since it's nearly 3 years later though, I've noticed that there seems to be a sense of cautionary optimism that has returned to the community with the latest DLC release that we haven't seen in a long time. To set the record straight, I'm not revisiting Stellaris just because I have a sunk cost fallacy after sinking nearly 1,000 hours into it, or because I exist purely to satisfy the YouTube algorithm, although both of those are true. Really, I believe the Stellaris dev team provides some of the best free updates to the base game, barring Le Guin, and I have always been willing to try out new content no matter how closely it aligns with my personal playstyle. With that in mind, this video really serves to contextualize how Stellaris has weathered some of its poorly reviewed DLCs, how Machine Age has addressed a lot of this, and where we go from here with Cosmic Storms coming up in the fall. I don't typically make that many Stellaris videos, but I have been playing the game since Leviathans, and I am very much a frequently returning player. One thing that I almost never touch though when it comes to Stellaris is Gestalt Empires, specifically robots, and that is ironically what this expansion covers in excruciating detail. The main reason I typically strayed away from Machine Empires, though I did dabble a bit with Hive Mind speaking of Gestalts, is that I felt they were very narrow-minded before Machine Age. This might come off as a funny critique, because robots are actually one of the best options for playing wide due to their nearly non-existent habitability restrictions. The mechanical trait gives them a whopping 200% habitability rating, which makes them perfect for difficult start origins like Shattered Ring and Life Seeded. Despite this, I always felt that Synthetic Dawn, the previous robot story pack, failed to deliver in making Machine Empires dynamic, but I will make an exception for Rogue Servitors. While Synthetic Dawn should get some credit for introducing playable robots in the first place, in retrospect, there is very little reason to buy it now that Machine Age is out. In my mind, the only justification for purchasing the former would be new story content in the form of resource consolidation and a few different civics.
You took everything from me.
I don't even know who you are.
Plantoids and other smaller, older paid content fell into a similar hole in my opinion, primarily because the content wasn't that fleshed out. Thankfully, we do have the Custodians team that goes back and revamps older content with new origins and other features, but I don't think that is enough to justify a purchase like the Synthetic Dawn pack. And with such an ambitious expansion, Stellaris took a fairly straightforward approach with improving on what it does best, adding interesting origins and civics. My favorite origin with this update was the Arc Welders, just because I love nothing more than melting down planets and creating my own mineral-obsessed dwarven hegemony, all but in flesh. But synthetics, up until this point, have had fairly middling options to start out with. Resource consolidation is very powerful because of the planet you start out with, but that's really it. Many other early origins that were added, like Remnants, give you an interesting starting situation, but there isn't much more beyond a few research boosts in a different planet. I kind of want to mention First Contact because it is the complete opposite of origins like Remnants. You have very complex roleplay mechanics and challenging starts that drastically change how your game plays out, with a unique empire as a rival to top things off. For Machine Age, I enjoy playing both types of origins, but I really think the devs have struck a good balance between having enough roleplay mechanics with cybernetic creed and synthetic fertility to adding more traditional origins with a twist like Arc Welders. Not every player is going to have the same taste, and even if a lot of players, myself included, love challenging origins like Payback, many people aren't that fond of RP and feel completely left out when paid content like First Contact rolls around. I don't blame them. With that in mind, this is going to be a big ask, but I would love to see a way for players to tweak starting origins so that more of their personal preferences could be incorporated. Instead of focusing on adding many different origins with each update, instead focus on making the way that you can play your pre-existing origins more meaningful. Maybe I want to adjust how strong MSI starts out. Perhaps I want the dynamics of a Scion relationship without all of the ridiculous gifts that my trust daddy of a fallen empire gives me. But let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with me on this take. I'm not going to spend the entire video glazing some of the fun origins this content introduced, but I will commend the team for trying to incorporate other players who may not be big fans of Gestalt Empires, like yours truly. I think that the devs, in their abundance of foresight, knew that it would be difficult to sell an expansion centered around a specific playstyle and price it at $25. Otherwise, I imagine they would end up with backlash from certain player groups. To paint a fuller picture, I have to briefly mention a certain expansion that may elicit a groan or two from these types of players. But this wouldn't really be a proper Stellaris DLC discussion without mentioning Nemesis, as most of the community had a negative reaction to it. I would even go as far to say that Nemesis wasn't polarizing, because so many people utterly despised some of the new espionage mechanics that it introduced, and I could hardly find people that were in support of the new changes. To be fair, the more recent reviews of Nemesis have been more forgiving, but the Imperial shipset and the expansion's focus on becoming the Crisis received a lot of hate, if my dilapidated brain is recalling things correctly. The reason why I bring Nemesis up isn't solely to get people riled up. I'm not trying to incite a crowd here. Rather, I feel that Nemesis and Machine Age to a larger extent feature one thing in common, focusing on a specific playstyle. Because of the way Nemesis is structured, you may end up not interacting with a majority of the mechanics that it introduces in a playthrough, and this was a point of contention for some players. As a consequence of this, I personally believe that the developers have tried to shy away from paid content revolving around a certain playstyle recently. With Nemesis and Megacorp, you may very much need to play a unique government type or Ascension perk to get the most out of these expansions. I will state though that Megacorp felt like it was one of the few scenarios where we received a positively reviewed expansion and a poorly received update. Megacorp did receive some criticism, but largely, Le Guin drove most of the discussion due to its performance issues with how the new pop system worked. Machine Age gets around this somewhat by introducing Satana. There has been a lot of discussion surrounding this chrome-plated woman of mysterious origin, and I am bringing her up purely to discuss how she interacts with gameplay mechanics. Wink wink. But in all seriousness, we haven't had a new in-game faction introduced since Nemesis, and even further back if you don't consider the scenario where you can become the Crisis. By and large, both the early game with precursors and the late game with crises have been very resistant to change from a development viewpoint. It's still shocking to me that we have not received any significant updates to precursor civilizations since Ancient Relics introduced individual precursor relics. And even then, newer editions like the Bao and Zeroni feel far better to interact with because they are baked into the archaeology system. But Satana wouldn't be interesting if she was your standard Crisis with Doomstacks that paints the map like a mad EU4 player. Instead, she has a far more dynamic and sinister entrance that is centered around attacking fallen empires first as opposed to the player and their Xeno friends. I will note that there is an exception for this, which lies with the Unbidden, always spawning near a fallen empire, but they don't really have a specific agenda or animus towards fallen empires like the Synthetic Queen does. Similar to the Khan, Satana is a unique empire that you can interact with. Although you cannot join her, to the chagrin of a certain set of players, though you can briefly support her, she is an upgrade to the contingency in many cases. What I mean by this is that the contingency as a Crisis can be very hit or miss. If you are playing as a machine empire or use a significant amount of robots, you are going to be disproportionately affected compared to someone like a fanatic spiritualist that has AI outlawed. This may be better for players that like to be immediately flung into the endgame, but when the Crisis spawns in a specific section of the galaxy, it is usually more measured and less chaotic. Feel free to disagree with me in the comment section, but I like the approach of having a Crisis that starts off from a smaller position and doesn't knock down the gates as soon as 2400 rolls around. Unlike the other crises we have faced thus far, the Synthetic Queen has a tiered approach. When she first becomes active and starts to take out other fallen empires, she also claims one outpost on the borders of both AI and player civilizations. There has been some criticism about Satana's special projects, which basically involves doing research tasks to figure out her plan for the universe and how to stop her before she eliminates all free will like a shonen antagonist. But dramatics aside, from a personal viewpoint, I love that we have a Crisis that is far more slow-moving and provides different ways for empires to cooperate other than contributing fleet power. As her plan to end free will is gradually revealed through completing special projects, players eventually gain the chance to attack her openly through a variety of methods. I think it's pretty understandable that some players don't like how controlling Satana can be with some of the modifiers she gives, as well as not allowing ships to enter her borders until war is declared on her. To that point, Satana is intended to be a slower moving threat that can't initially be Zerg rushed through. She is one of the few endgame opponents that can be undermined without declaring all-out war by ambushing convoys and opening her data caches. It wouldn't be Stellaris without a few interesting interactions that make it possible for you to one-tap Satana and exploit her, and I wanted to highlight a few of the weak points of her design. If you have completed the Psionic Ascension path, you can quite literally march into the Shroud, fork over some Zero, and delete this cyber baddie from the map immediately. The amount of Zero required is ludicrous, but seeing as you get her Colossus and take care of an in-game threat in the click of a button, it can be a very potent option. When all is said and done, her fleets aren't particularly powerful provided you have the right loadouts, and once her Colossus is destroyed, she is erased from the game. Time and again, the developers have made a push to go back and deconstruct some of Stellaris' most fundamental concepts. This was the case with how they tackled Satana as an endgame crisis, and I also believe that they were trying to do something similar with Astral Planes. As the dev team shies away from groundbreaking and immensely time-consuming reworks of core features, to be fair we don't have that many left, I think a different approach is being adopted gradually as content is phased out. When it inevitably comes time to change up core gameplay systems like Apocalypse, Utopia, and Federations did, you are going to step on some toes no matter what you do. We are only just now seeing an approach that relies on offering alternative content that provides a different gameplay experience, and the player can choose whether or not they wish to opt in. This was 100% the case for Astral Planes, where it was essentially a relaunch of Astral Relics, and I suspect that it will also be the case for Cosmic Storms, which is the next paid content feature. Really quickly, I want to say though that by opting in, you can quite literally turn off the entire DLC and not participate, which I think is quite different from previous content strategies we've seen so far. I know this is primarily a Machine Age focused video, however I firmly believe Astral Planes failed because it poorly communicated its intentions and that it was far too pricey for a very similar product that was previously offered at half off. For newer players, Astral Planes is competing against a cheaper product that is more positively reviewed, and is also more immediately accessible in the early game. I've spoken about this in my CK3 videos, but price creep is a very serious consideration, and I think that this is why the expansion is priced at $25 USD, unlike other recent expansions that sit at $30. As Paradox's recent launches like Victoria 3 have shaken player trust, I wouldn't find it all too surprising if we continue to see release dates for new content further apart. CK3, Stellaris, and Victoria 3 may not have the same dev team, but their audiences definitely overlap, and they make informed decisions on what to purchase. There's not really a term for it, but one other strategy that we may continue to see with Machine Age's success are vertical DLCs. Expansions like Megacorp and Apocalypse were focused on improving specific aspects of the game. Megacorp dedicated a lot of its space to new commercial government types, and Apocalypse innovated with mid to late game warfare. This expansion instead scatters several pieces of content throughout the early, mid, and late portions of the game. In part, this is certainly a result of the game going on for 8+ years, but it may also result from a fear of going all in on one or two mechanics and failing to appease the core audience. Overlord and Legends of the Dead are examples of this, and are what I would consider to be more horizontal expansions, where you have features like Vassalage and Dynastic Fables that the DLC can enhance. Lastly, I've been noticing a shift going on with Paradox as of late with how they develop paid content, and I don't think this is entirely a hallucination on my part. It is true that we are seeing more spaced out releases for paid content with the new Season Pass model, but the devs in general seem to be more receptive to criticism. The free updates that came with Apocalypse and Utopia were very much a static vision. The developers released dev diaries on what they were working on, and although they did make a few tweaks here and there, things were largely unchanged. I don't know how Paradox deals with studios on an individual basis, but it's not a stretch to say that this practice may be more widely adopted with the coming releases. Speaking of which, with Cosmic Storms coming up, I still think there's a lot of pressure riding on the dev team, even after the success of Machine Age. Given that it's advertised as a mechanical expansion, I'm praying that there isn't a wild amount of RNG that causes these storms to be strict malices to empires. If there is anything Paradox players hate, it is random events popping up and destabilizing realms. I'm looking specifically at you, EU4 Comet. From the screenshots that have been teased so far, we know that storms have a predictable pattern that can be charted with certain technologies. If I'm being honest, the unlockable tech coupled with strange, system-specific events is a little too reminiscent of Astral Planes for my liking, but I'll hold my breath. I just can't see an expansion's worth of content being justified for space storms, but who knows. I think the worst case scenario here is having random events that interrupt early gameplay where you can't predict these storms, and have entire fleets devastated, making you a perfect target for the AI to eat up. In the current game, we have some degree of naturally occurring phenomena, but the developer's language makes it seem like these storms are greater threats, not so much boons or busts. But that's all of the yapping that I'll do for today's video. I wanted to break out of the usual CK3 loop that I've been on for the past few months and talk about something different that I have familiarity with, and Stellaris fits that niche quite well in my opinion. That said, if you have other video topics that you'd like me to explore, Stellaris or otherwise, please let me know in the comment section below. I'm always happy to discuss the Imperium's latest and greatest Xeno processing policies. Thank you so much for watching, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and hit that notification bell to stay updated for future 4 Extraordinary content. Thank you guys so much for watching again, love you guys, and I hope to see you. Peace.